In the small coastal town of Skagen, on the northern tip of Denmark, storms were commonplace. A strong wind tore tiles from roofs, waves crashed with a deafening roar on the rocky shore, and the sky turned into alarming shades of gray and black. Residents have long been accustomed to these natural disasters, but this storm was special. In the evening, when the sea was raging with particular fury, fishermen from the port barricaded themselves in their homes, watched the spectacle from a safe distance. Old Johan, sitting at the window of his small hut for the first time in a long time, felt something unusual, something that had dulled in him over the years, namely animal fear. Local fishermen believed in omens, and knew when a storm was just a storm, and when it carried something more. Around midnight, there was a strange crackling in the sky, and through the thunder and howling wind, the fishermen noticed a strange glow. The light was not like lightning, it was more constant, shining brightly like red-hot metal. The object moved slowly across the sky, before suddenly plunging down and disappearing into the waves of the Skagerrak Strait. Johan clutched at his heart, trying to figure out what had happened. He had seen many things in his long life, but nothing like this. He knew every legend related to the sea, about strange creatures, about mysterious ships that disappeared in the waters of the Skagerrak. But this was something new. The next morning, when the storm began to subside, a group of young fishermen went to the coast to explore the beach after the violence of the elements. Usually after such storms, discarded boards, fishing gear, and sometimes even lost boats were found on the shore. But this time, they came across something completely different. Strange metal structures lay on the sand, among seaweed and debris. They glistened in the sun, although they were covered with a thin layer of salt and sand. The fragments were smooth, almost without seams, and clearly did not belong to any of the local fishing vessels. The surface was covered with incomprehensible signs or symbols that none of the fishermen could identify. The locals quickly spread rumors, and by noon, several dozen people gathered at the beach, discussing the find. Old-timers whispered about sea creatures and aliens from the depths, about ancient legends that they had heard from their ancestors. Someone talked about mysterious ships in the night. Someone recalled stories of shipwrecks that never found an explanation. But soon, something even stranger appeared. People in black uniforms allegedly belonging to the Danish Naval Service arrived at the scene. They silently and quickly began to clean up the debris, driving away curious residents. People were politely but persistently asked to disperse without asking questions. None of the locals knew these people, and where could they have come from so quickly, given that Skagen was an isolated, godforsaken town? Johan was watching from a hill. He did not believe that this was an ordinary military unit. They moved too clearly, and their equipment seemed too new and advanced for local service. In the evening, local news reported that the discovered debris was part of a secret test equipment that fell into the sea. However, the old men and fishermen of the city knew that it was a lie. There are too many questions, too many strange coincidences, and those metal fragments, they didn't look like anything that could be created on this planet. Nikolai Jensen was sitting on the train, staring out the window at the gloomy, gray landscapes of northern Denmark. He was holding an old leather bag containing a notebook, a dictaphone, and a camera. Everything he could need for a journalistic investigation. The letter he received was anonymous, but it contained information that sparked in him the hope of a real career breakthrough. The letter talked about a strange incident in the small coastal town of Skagen, and hinted that it might be related to UFOs. Nikolai understood that if the story was confirmed, it could be his ticket to the major media. He knew that such stories always attracted attention. If not the public, then at least those who crave sensations. The young journalist got off at a tiny station, where he was greeted by a cold sea wind. Skagen looked deserted, like most coastal towns in northern Denmark. Approaching the local tavern, which served not only as a bar, but also as a meeting place for all local fishermen, Nikolai took a deep breath of air, feeling the slight smell of fish and salt. Inside, Nikolai immediately noticed a group of old men sitting at one of the tables. Among them stood out an old man with thick gray hair and a wrinkled face, Johan, whom Nikolai learned about from a letter. Nikolai walked over to the table. "Hi, I'm Nikolai Jensen, a journalist from Copenhagen. I'm here about, well, in general, how can I say, a recent incident. I heard that you could tell me more." Johan narrowed his eyes, studying the young man from head to toe. "A journalist, you say?" The old man looked at his friends, who were curiously watching the newcomer. "So, you've heard about the glow in the sky?" "Yes, I heard." Nikolai pulled out a notebook and a dictaphone, preparing to write down the old man's words. "Were you a witness?" "Everyone here was a witness, boy." Johan smiled skeptically. "Light in the sky, strange sounds, and then, bang, something fell into the sea. I saw it with my own eyes. And then these military men, they quickly cleaned up everything, but there is something left." "Is there any left?" Nikolai was surprised. Moving closer, Johan leaned forward and his wrinkled face became serious. "There is someone here who managed to hide the wreckage before these people in uniform came." Nikolai felt his heart beat faster. He understood that this might be the proof he needed. "Can I see this?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to remain calm. Johan looked around at the other fishermen, as if asking for their approval, and one of the men nodded in response. "Torben, show him," Johan said, nodding towards a younger fisherman with short hair. Torben stood up silently and nodded to Nikolai, gesturing for him to follow. They went outside. The wind was even stronger now. Torben led him towards a small warehouse hidden behind the port building. The door creaked loudly when he opened it, and they went inside. There, among the old fishing gear and wooden boxes, was hidden what the fisherman had found. Torben pulled out a small package wrapped in an old rag from behind the shelves. He unfolded it and showed Nikolai some metal fragments. "Here they are," he said, handing the journalist the strange fragments. "I found them on the beach the morning after the storm. I hid them when I realized that the military had come to look for something." Nikolai studied the wreckage carefully. They were strangely shaped, smooth, as if they were made of some unearthly material. There were no visible seams or marks or scratches on them. The fragments were covered with incomprehensible characters similar to hieroglyphs, but none of them were familiar to Nikolai. This is incredible," he whispered, feeling his hands begin to tremble slightly with excitement. "Do you understand what this could be?" Torben nodded, but he didn't look so enthusiastic. "I do not know what it is, but I know one thing for sure. It is not from our world." His voice was full of doubt. "I've heard stories from old people, and it reminds me of those stories about strange ships that disappeared in these waters many years ago. Maybe these are the aliens that everyone is whispering about." Nikolai swallowed, realizing that he was holding something in his hands that could become a real sensation. But then, a question popped into his head that he couldn't help but ask. "Why are you showing this to me? Why wasn't it handed over to scientists or the government?" Torben frowned and looked at Nikolai suspiciously. "Because I don't trust the government. I saw how quickly they arrived and cleaned everything up. We have our own laws and our own secrets here. And you can tell the truth." Nikolai thought about his words. He knew that such a story could not only glorify him, but also attract the attention of those who clearly did not want this truth to surface. But the choice has already been made. Now it all depended on how far he was willing to go for the truth. Torben put the pieces back in the rag and handed them to Nick. "I don't know what you're hoping for, kid, but be careful. What you're looking for could cost you your life." Nikolai Jensen was sitting in a small rented room on the outskirts of Skagen. The walls of the old house, soaked in the sea air, seemed to him both cozy and intimidating. There were fragments on the table in front of him, the same metal fragments that he had received from Torben. The streets of the city were quiet, as always. But Nikolai knew that something was hiding behind this silence. He couldn't leave the story. Feeling that he was getting closer to something, his first thought was to reach out to people who could provide a scientific explanation for the appearance of these debris. He knew several scientists from Copenhagen, people who were interested in unusual phenomena, and their help could take his investigation to a new level. That evening, he sent several urgent letters, attaching photographs of the finds and describing the situation. 2 days later, 2 scientists arrived in Skagen. They were old acquaintances of Nikolai: Lars, a physicist, and Jesper, a chemist who understood modern materials. The meeting took place in a small coffee shop where they could talk without prying ears. "So, what's the mystery here?" Lars took the floor first, looking around. He was always a skeptic, but he listened to Nikolai with interest. Nikolai placed the metal fragments in front of them, and there was silence for a few seconds. Jesper picked up the wreckage. "This is incredible," he whispered, staring at the smooth surface of the metal. "I've never seen anything like it. I have never seen such material." "What could it be?" Nikolai asked, carefully watching the reaction of his friends. Jesper shook his head, trying to figure out what they were dealing with. "I can't say for sure, but this thing is too perfect for terrestrial production. No visible seams, no signs of processing. We could take samples and run tests, but I already have suspicions that this will raise a lot of questions from the authorities." "That's right," Lars agreed. "I'm not sure we should go into this. We could get into trouble." "Do you understand that this is not just a find on the beach, Nikolai? If that's what I think it is, you're playing with fire." Nikolai frowned, realizing the gravity of the situation. "But that's the essence of journalism, to get to the truth. Aren't you interested in what's going on here? It could be something really important, perhaps even on a global scale." Jesper was silent, staring at the metal fragments as if struggling with himself. Finally, he put down the fragment and turned to Nikolai. "Nikolai, I understand that this may be your chance to break into big journalism, but we can't continue. We were already asked questions when we arrived here. I saw how we were being watched. I have a feeling that if we don't stop now, something bad could happen." Nikolai felt a chill inside. He didn't want to admit it, but what his friend said was true. He also noticed strangers on the streets of Skagen, who appeared as if by chance in the places where he visited. But the thought that he might give up, leaving the case unfinished, was unbearable for him. "So you're leaving? What is it?" he asked, not even hiding his disappointment. "Yes, we're leaving tomorrow morning," Lars replied quietly. "You don't know what you're dealing with." They said goodbye, and Nikolai returned to his room. He was alone now. Nikolai felt that he was on the verge of an important discovery. The days went on as usual. He walked around the neighborhood a lot, studied the coastline where local fishermen found the wreckage. He often spent time in the archives of the local library, digging through old newspapers and diaries, hoping to find at least some connection with the events of the past. But in recent days, one thing had been bothering him more and more. He felt that he was being watched. Wherever he went, to a cafe, to the seashore, or even to the store, he saw the same people, men in inconspicuous clothes who were watching him. Trying to remain unnoticed, he caught their eyes on him. When they were standing on a street corner, or supposedly casually sitting in a bar, Nikolai understood that his investigation had attracted unwanted attention. One night a storm broke out. The sea was raging. The wind was shaking the shutters and knocking wet raindrops out of the windows. Nikolai was lying in his small room, but he couldn't sleep. The noise of the storm outside the window was getting on my nerves, and thoughts of mysterious events haunted me. He was just starting to doze off when a sudden sharp knock on the door made him jump. Nikolai opened the door, and in front of him stood Torben, the fisherman who had once shown him those strange wrecks. "Torben, what happened?" asked Nikolai, noticing the tension on the fisherman's face. "It started again," Torben croaked, looking around as if he was afraid he was being watched. "Light in the sky sounds. It's just like that time. You have to see this." Without hesitation, Nikolai grabbed his camera and followed Torben. They walked quickly. Through a thick veil of rain, wet drops slashing their faces, the noise of the sea seemed to merge with the thunder, creating an unbearable rumble that grew more and more. When they reached the coast, Nikolai noticed that all life seemed to have disappeared around him. There was not a soul on the beach, just the two of them, and the dark waves that beat menacingly against the shore. Suddenly, lights appeared over the sea. They were bright and dazzling. Nikolai immediately turned on the camera and began filming. "Oh my god, this is incredible," he whispered, trying to focus the lens on these mysterious lights here. "It definitely can't be a natural phenomenon." Torben looked around nervously. It was obvious that he did not like what was happening. "We have to leave," the fisherman insisted, grabbing Nikolai's hand. "They will come, just like that time. We can't stay here." But Nikolai pulled away, pushing Torben away. "No, I have to take it off. This is proof. I can't leave." Torben looked back at the sea. The light became unbearably bright, and suddenly the roar began to grow. The sound was so strong that it drowned out even the noise of the storm. Nikolai tried to continue shooting, but the water hit his hands and they slipped off. "Nikolai, I beg you, go away." Torben's voice became more anxious. He grabbed the journalist by the shoulder, trying to pull him away from the shore. "You don't understand what's going on." But Nikolai was adamant. Suddenly, the roar reached its climax, and the sky burst into bright light. A blinding flash covered them, and for a moment the whole world disappeared in a white glow. When Nikolai woke up, he was lying on the wet sand, and there was an ominous silence around. The storm had subsided, and now only the faint lapping of the waves beat against the shore. He got to his feet, still feeling a little dizzy, but Torben was nowhere to be seen. "Torben! Torben!" Nikolai shouted, looking around. The fisherman disappeared, as if he had never existed. The journalist suddenly felt a wave of fear rising inside him. He started walking along the shore, trying to find his companion, but then he heard a rustle behind him. Turning around, Nikolai saw a group of people coming out of the forest. They were wearing dark waterproof suits and hoods covering their faces. Before Nikolai could do anything, two men grabbed his arms, roughly pinning him to the ground. His camera fell out of his hands, and one of the strangers quickly picked it up. "Hey, what are you doing? Who are you?" Nikolai shouted, trying to escape, but it was all useless. One of them leaned towards him, and Nikolai felt a cold breath on his face. "You were warned, journalist," the man whispered, his voice flat and emotionless. "Now you're definitely going to stop." Nikolai was sitting on a hard chair in a strange room that resembled a police station, but the atmosphere was too sterile and cold. The lighting was dim, and a heavy silence filled the air. The people who brought him here were definitely not policemen. Their movements were coordinated, and their faces were impassive. Nikolai did not know where he was or what awaited him next, but he understood that he was in a very unpleasant situation. The door to the room creaked, and a tall man in a strict black suit entered the room. He was confident, with a face that betrayed no emotion. The man sat down opposite Nikolai and put a folder with papers on the table. "Mr. Jensen," the man said in a low voice, "my name is Johansson. I'm here to explain to you that you're meddling in something that's not your business. And now, it's time to stop." "Who are you?" Nikolai asked, his voice hoarse and his throat terribly dry. "What do you know about what happened on the coast? What are those lights? Was it a ship?" Johansson did not answer, just looked at the journalist with a slight smile, as if he did not care what Nikolai said. "Where's Torben?" Nikolai asked sharply, feeling that control over the situation was slipping away. Johansson opened the folder and slowly pulled out several photos. He threw them on the table in front of Nikolai. The images showed the mutilated body of a fisherman. Torben's face was almost unrecognizable. Nikolai instinctively recoiled. "Why? Why did you kill him?" whispered Nikolai, feeling everything inside shrink with horror. "It's not us," Johansson replied coolly, leaning back in his chair. His words sounded as if the fisherman's death was something ordinary. "Then who is it?" Nikolai almost shouted. "What's going on here? Who is responsible for this?" Johansson raised one eyebrow, as if Nikolai's question was meaningless. "It's none of your business, Mr. Jensen," he said coldly. "What you really need to understand is that now you have only two options." Nikolai looked at the man in disbelief. "What do you mean by that?" "It's simple." Johansson sighed, as if telling something obvious. "Either they'll pin Torben's murder on you, and you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, or we'll send you to a psychiatric clinic, where you'll forget everything you've seen and never ask unnecessary questions again." Nikolai jumped up from his seat. His rage overwhelmed him. "You want to destroy my life. You can't just shut me up like that," he shouted. Then, unable to restrain himself, rushed at Johansson. At the same moment, two men in black uniforms entered the room. They quickly grabbed Nikolai by the arms and pinned him to a chair. One of them took out a syringe and injected Nikolai with a dose of tranquilizer. "Don't worry, Mr. Jensen. You'll soon forget about everything you've seen," Johansson said calmly, brushing off his suit. The world in front of the journalist's eyes began to spin, and his body became sluggish and wadded. The last thing he saw before he fell into darkness was the unflappable gaze of Johansson, who was sitting opposite, watching him fall into the abyss. 15 years have passed since Nikolai Jensen disappeared from public view. His name has long been forgotten in journalistic circles, and the strange events in Skagen have become only part of urban legends and rumors that have appeared from time to time on forums of ufologists and fans of conspiracy theories. But for Mark Bertson, a young blogger and social media star, Nikolai's story was a real sensation. On one of the sites where auctions are held, he came across a copy of a draft of Nikolai's article about mysterious lights on the coast, and was obsessed with the idea of unearthing the truth. It was his opportunity to get millions of views and maybe reveal something really important to the world. Mark paid a lot of money to get access to a clinic on the outskirts of Copenhagen, where Nikolai Jensen was said to be staying. The clinic was hidden from prying eyes, and access to it was strictly limited. No one was interested in what was going on here. Officially, it was a psychiatric hospital for those who had lost themselves, but Mark knew that among its patients, there were those who simply knew too. He drove up to the gate in his car. His heart was beating faster than usual when he entered the building. He was accompanied by a doctor, who Mark paid. Still, it's great that people are always looking for you. The room where the meeting was to take place was gloomy. Nikolai Jensen was sitting on an old armchair covered with faded fabric. He looked old and exhausted. His eyes were empty, indifferent to what was happening. "Nikolai Jensen," Mark began, standing in front of him and pulling out a tablet with photos. "I'm Mark Bertson, a blogger. You know, I'm very interested in your story." No reaction. 15 years have passed, but people are still talking about the incident in Skagen, about the light in the sky, about the strange metal fragments that you found. What happened then? I know that you know the truth. Nikolai remained motionless. He was sitting in an armchair, clutching the armrests. His gaze was directed somewhere through Mark, into the void. Mark didn't give up. He began showing photographs from the scene, old newspaper clippings, images of strange lights on the coast, photographs of debris that Nikolai had once tried to publish. "Do you remember Torben?" Mark tried to bring back some memories. "He was your friend. I found everything related to him. People say he was killed after the incident. You know what happened, don't you? Is it because of the metal? I know that there was metal of a strange origin." Nikolai remained silent. His face remained expressionless. "Why are you silent?" Mark asked irritably, getting up from his chair. "You know more than any of us. Why don't you want to talk? Why did you let them hide it all?" Mark was ready to give up. It looked like Nikolai was really out of his mind. Mark decided it was time to leave, but suddenly he felt a sharp push in his arm. Nikolai, who had been sitting motionless before, suddenly came to life. He grabbed Mark's wrist with force. His eyes lit up with a mad glare and he began to shout, "Don't do this, no need." Nikolai was trembling. His voice was full of fear. "Don't do this, no need. They'll find you." Mark froze in surprise. He hadn't expected such an outburst of emotion. The panic in Nikolai's voice was frightening. Mark tried to pull away, but Nikolai continued to scream, "You don't understand what they will do. You don't know what I saw. Don't touch it. Stop before it's too late." "Scared," Mark screamed, calling for the paramedics. Two men in white coats burst into the room and quickly tore Nikolai away from the blogger, grabbing his hands tightly. Nikolai continued to scream, "Don't do this. You don't want to disappear like Torben. Stop it. Stop it." The paramedics dragged Nikolai out of the room, his screams echoing through the empty corridors of the clinic until the door slammed shut. Mark was left standing alone, his heart pounding in his chest. He barely realized what had just happened. He left the clinic with a heavy feeling in his soul. He didn't want to take the warnings of a crazy man seriously. He went home. In his mind, he kept returning to this meeting with the journalist. That's probably why he didn't notice that a strange white van was following him.